and welcome to New England Author. So good to have you. We explore different aspects of New England, and today we're going to talk about music. We have our author here is Tom Wolf. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay, and you're the author of the Nightingale Sonata. We're going to talk about that, and it's really about your grandmother, the virtuoso violinist Lea Luboshutz.
Very good. Not everybody can pronounce that.
Oh, okay.
Lea Luboshutz was my grandmother, and there were many other members of the family that were musicians as well. Her brother and her sister, they formed a trio, and of course her son, Boris Goldovsky, an opera producer, and our generation. I was a musician. My brother Andrew was a pianist, so many musicians in the family.
Yeah, yeah. So Lea, your grandmother, I want to give us a little historical perspective. She was born in Odessa of a poor Jewish family. Odessa, though you describe as a kind of a cosmopolitan city for its time.
It was a port town.
Right on the Black Sea there.
On the Black Sea, a polyglot, and there were many, many Jews there. It was part of what's called the Pale of Settlement, where Jews were permitted to live. And the effort of many Jews was to escape beyond the Pale and get to the big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. And there were three ways you could do that. One was through immense wealth, one was through great intellect and talent, and one was through music. Mm-hmm. And my grandmother and her siblings, all three managed to get beyond the Pale and get to Moscow. In fact, there's a very funny Jewish expression about how you know whether your Jewish children are going to become mathematicians. And the answer is the ones not carrying a violin case.
Okay. So you brought up Beyond the Pale. So this was something, was it Catherine the Great that mapped out this area called the Pale,
right,
and which gives us now our, I didn't know this until your book, about the expression Beyond the Pale.
Yeah, well, 1791, Catherine established a strip of land from the north, from the Black Sea, all the way up. And that's where Jews were allowed to live without permit. And if they wanted to live outside of that, they had to get special permission.
So talk a little about the persecution of the Jews and the pogroms of 1880.
Well, both in Odessa and also where my grandfather, Onisim Goldovsky, lived, in Vilnius, which was often called the Jerusalem of the North, there were severe pogroms. After the assassination of the Tsar, Jews were accused of being in league to kill him, and many pogroms happened. But they happened throughout Russian history. It was not just then.
Yeah. Yeah, so there was a lot of persecution on the, against the Jews, but Lea was a child prodigy, right?
She was.
And then she went to St. Petersburg to study.
No, not St. Petersburg. What happened was that she was a prodigy, and when Leopold Auer, the great violin teacher, came to Odessa, he heard her play, and he invited her at the age of 11 to come study with him in St. Petersburg.
Oh, that's right. That's right. She couldn't do it.
She couldn't do it because neither one of her parents could go with her. But there were relatives in Moscow. So she went, it was a slightly lesser conservatory at the time. She went to the Moscow Conservatory, where she had a brilliant career, won the coveted gold medal, and then received the patronage of Onisim Goldovsky, who was a lawyer and a revolutionary and quite a wealthy man.
So what happened to your family after the Russian Revolution of 1917?
Well, my grandfather was involved in the revolution, but there were many parties, and his party really advocated for a constitutional democracy, and they were despised by the Bolsheviks. So when the Bolsheviks came to power, our family was in great distress. And my grandmother and my Uncle Boris left the country on a concert tour and never came back. But then Onisim died. And the real challenge was how were they going to get the other members of the family out of Russia, and that was a whole story unto itself. A member of the German diplomatic corps went over, pretended he was my mother's father, and got her out as well.
But some of your family must have suffered in the Holocaust.
It is true. There were a couple of members of my family. It's a sad story because they came to America and they were safe in 1938, but they had a child who was sick in Paris. They went back, they thought they were safe, and eventually ended up being rounded up and killed in the Holocaust.
So we had a lot of people who went to France thought that they were safe from the Germans.
It's interesting, one other example of anti-Semitism. Some of my family stayed in Russia because they were well treated. One was my great uncle, Nikolai Shereshevsky, who was a physician and was beloved by the state until Stalin dreamed up this thing called the doctor's plot right before his death and arrested many Jewish doctors and considered them murderers and collaborators. And it was only Stalin's death which protected him from being killed.
Yeah, I never heard of this. He rounded up doctors? I guess
yes,
he rounded up everybody else.
Yeah,
why not round up doctors
rounded
as
up
well?
Jewish doctors.
Yeah.
And it was only a matter of months before my great uncle would have lost his life, but Stalin died first.
Yeah. So in this Nightingale Sonata, you talk a lot about your grandmother. You just have a great love for her. And did she, being a woman, did that affect her career?
It did, very much so.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with being a woman in the performing arts is there was this whole tradition of women in the performing arts being sort of thought to be women of leisure, perhaps prostitutes, looking for patrons who would then marry them and set them up. And so throughout her career, she was fighting this persistent attitude that maybe the reason that she was as successful as she was because she was sleeping her way to the top. The problem I had in kind of dealing with this situation, in many cases she was sleeping with a number of lovers, and not her talent was plenty, but she also had many lovers during her time, including, by the way, my grandfather, to whom she was never married because my grandfather Onisim was married to another woman.
Oh, I see. Oh, this is a family intrigue here. Yeah,
absolutely.
Oh, okay.
And this is something I only found out when we began the research.
Right, right. You had some surprises there in your family history.
Well, you know, when you grow up in a family like mine, there are the family stories, and you learn the family stories and you believe them. And I was always told that my grandmother had been married to this wonderful man, Onisim Goldovsky, who lost his life in the Russian Revolution. Then in the year 2000, the biography of the writer Rachel Kin was published in the United States. And in it, there was described Rachel Kin's husband by the name of Onisim Goldovsky. So I started to ask questions. There couldn't have been two. And they said, well, the story's slightly different. He had been married to her. She wouldn't give him a divorce. And then he was kind of married to your grandmother. But when we actually did the research and read the diaries in the Moscow archives, we found that he actually maintained 2 households and 2 families.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. So were there? So you feel comfortable talking about this. Are there some things in your family you didn't feel comfortable talking about?
Well, there was one thing that was very sensitive. I was working with a Russian cousin who was in Moscow and doing a lot of the research there. And her family had beloved relatives, one of whom was actually collaborating in some of the show trials and testifying on behalf of the regime. And this was information that when we discovered it was painful for the family.
I see, okay. So you introduce many people in the book. Pablo Casals, the great cellist. By the way, we were just at the Kennedy museum, I really recommend going to the Kennedy Library in Dorchester. And we saw that there's this great picture, a great big picture of Jackie and John Kennedy with Pablo Casals in 1961. He played for Teddy Roosevelt in 1904 at the White House.
Well, this is a very interesting story that you bring it up, because Pablo Casals did not play in this country for many, many decades, because we recognized Franco-Spain.
Right.
And that concert at the White House was one of the very first concerts when he began to perform again. Of course, a few years later, he was on tour, and he came to Philadelphia. And he had stayed with my grandmother in the old days in Moscow.
He stayed in your house.
Yeah. And so she went backstage. She hadn't seen him for 50 years. And she said, "Do you remember Lea Luboshutz? You stayed in her house." And he said, "Oh, of course. Where is she?" And she said, "Oh, I am Lea." And they threw their arms around one another. And she said, he said to her, "So are you still performing and are you still practicing?" And she said, "No, I retired long ago. Here are my grandchildren. They're the musicians now."
You.
And he said, "Yeah, me." And he said, "Lea, that's terrible. You have to practice. At least you have to practice. I practice and make love every day." This was the 84-year-old Pablo Casals.
Yeah, he was living in Puerto Rico at the time. So some of the other people, Arthur Schnabel, the great pianist, Prokofiev, Tolstoy, and the dancer Isadora Duncan. These were all people that you mentioned in your book, right?
Isadora Duncan is an interesting one. She, of course, was an American dancer, free-form dance, modern, sort of modern dance type. And when she came to Russia, they loved her. But she had very great difficulty finding an accompanist, a pianist, because all of the classical pianists felt that she was not doing a good thing relative to classical music. And my uncle at that time was a young pianist looking for work, so he became her accompanist. And that was a great thing, because when he was ready to leave Russia, and it was very difficult to leave Russia in those years, she was so popular with the Soviets that she actually helped him to get out and get to Paris.
Great story. This is New England Authors. We're talking with Tom Wolfe. His book is The Nightingale Sonata. And one of the things I've noticed, I love classical music. You probably know that, and opera. And when I go to concerts, there's a lot of Russian voices I hear. You know, the Russians really love music and ballet and stuff. It's part of the culture, part of the upbringing, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You grow up with that. Well, you're a musician too. We'll get to you in just a second, but you're a musician as well. What is it in Russian culture that makes them love music?
Well, I think part of it is that many of the Russians who left after the fall of the Soviet Union, many who came to this country, a lot of them were Jews, a lot of them were practicing musicians, and they established the core of many of the great orchestras, and those that were not musicians but went into business and law and so on. Yeah, medicine, there you go. They became the patrons who supported these organizations. Right. So there was a great tradition, but there still is a great tradition in the Soviet Union, of course. The Tchaikovsky competition, there's always a Soviet violinist or pianist who is in the finals.
Yeah. So your mother did, if I remember right, she played Amati first, right?
My grandmother.
Yeah, I'm sorry, your grandmother. She played an Amati, right? This is a great violinist, great violin, and then she was given a Stradivarius, and all the Stradivarius have names. You know. Could you talk a little about her instrument?
Sure. She was given, when she finished at the conservatory, she was given a wonderful instrument by Nicolai Amati, which was one of the great Italian makers, which she played for many years. And then she sort of fell out of love with it, and she was experimenting with different instruments, and a gentleman came backstage and said that he would like to help her, and he knew that she was looking for an instrument, and he would be willing to help. And for 2 or 3 years, she searched all over the world and finally found this beautiful Stradivarius called the Nightingale. And that's the Nightingale of the title.
Right, the title of the book, the
Right.
Nightingale Sonata, yeah.
And she played that instrument until her death. And at that time, she very much wanted one of her students to continue playing it. So it was sold to one of her students when he died. Unfortunately, it went into this market of investors. And today, sadly, no one knows where it is. It's probably
really?
in a bank vault somewhere. And it's worth millions of dollars. But when I inquired about getting a color photograph of this great instrument for the book, I was informed that the owner had a non-disclosure agreement and he would not permit my being in touch with him or even getting photographs.
Incredible, incredible. So the Boston Symphony Orchestra some years ago knew that this was happening, that investors were buying these instruments and they were getting rare, and so they established a special fund so that people can play these instruments, not necessarily own them.
I want to tell you a wonderful story about the instruments. My grandmother felt very strongly that these instruments needed to be played. And at a certain point, she read a newspaper article about the great shortage of Italian instruments, the golden period Italian instruments in the Soviet Union, because so many people like her had left with their instruments, and when they came up for sale, people in the Soviet Union were not in a position to purchase them. And so at the height of the Cold War, she made a decision that she would send her Amati back to Moscow to be used by another talented student at the Moscow Conservatory. People thought she was crazy, naive, financially naive, but for her, the idea was a great instrument needed to be played. This instrument had been given to her. She was going to give it back.
Oh, that's great. That's great. If you're just joining us, this is New England Authors, and we're talking about the Nightingale Sonata with Tom Wolf. Your uncle, Boris Goldovsky, he became this great conductor, and he specialized in opera, right? Could you tell us a little about him and why he was part of the family, why he was part of the family musical heritage?
Sure. My grandmother had 3 children. The oldest, Yuri, stayed in the Soviet Union and became a mathematician. The second child was Boris. He was a very gifted pianist. And when the revolution came, part of the challenge for the family was to get enough to eat. And my grandmother got to play concerts for the workers and got paid in food. And so did the accompanist. So my uncle, aged 9, barely able to play these accompaniments, would go with her and play, and they loved it. On my website, you can see a photograph of him in his sailor suit. And when he played a solo, he got extra money. So he became a soloist in order to make food for the family. When they went to Berlin, he studied with Arthur Schnabel. Later, he studied with Dochnany. He came to the Curtis Institute and eventually specialized in opera. Because Serge Koussevitzky, the conductor of the Boston Symphony who founded Tanglewood, was a great family friend. He established Boris as the head of the opera department at Tanglewood, and he stayed there during the Koussevitzky years, eventually starting his own opera company, first here in Boston and then in New York.
Serge Koussevitzky, I forgot to mention him, great friend of your family's. So Lea also taught at the Curtis Institute, right?
That's right. She was brought to America first by Saul Hurok, the great manager, artist representative. She played with Joseph Hoffman, the pianist who became the director of Curtis, and he brought her in 1928 to join the faculty of the Curtis Institute.
Did she have a specialty, romantic, classical? What was her specialty? By the way, I tried to find recordings of her, and I couldn't find
You won't. My grandmother was very anti-recording.
Really?
If you look up her brother, Pierre Luboshutz of Luboshutz and Nemenov, you'll see all kinds of stuff on YouTube. He was a pianist and the duo piano team. But my grandmother felt very strongly that live performance was where the most important thing, and that the hall itself was part of the experience and the spontaneity. She made only one recording that I'm aware of I own it. It's very rare, and it only lasts for like 2 or 3 minutes. It was made in 1909 in St. Petersburg. But other than that, people tell me that some of the broadcasts were recorded, but I've never found them.
So did she play especially Russian?
She played Russian. It's interesting to me that she also championed contemporary music of all kinds. These days, the great soloists sort of stick to the tried and true.
Right.
But she felt very strongly that part of her responsibility was to introduce the works of new composers, which is one of the reasons why she played the first performance of the Prokofiev First Violin Concerto in New York with Dochniani conducting.
Mm-hmm. So what about you? Did you feel like pressure that you had to become a musician when you were a kid, or could you become a doctor or a mathematician?
I was one of 6 children.
Yeah.
I was number 5. The first 3 children, my mother was kind of anything to keep them from being musicians. You know?
Oh,
that was my mother. And my grandmother then put her foot down when it came to my brother and me, and she said she was going to take over. So she taught my brother and me violin, and it was a dreadful experience. I mean, she was strict. We were with her almost every day in the summer. When we put our finger in the wrong place, she would hit it with a ruler, and she would yell and scream.
Oh, yeah.
So when we were 8 years old, we were allowed to switch to a different instrument. My brother switched to piano. I switched to flute. But she still was very important in terms of guiding us as musicians.
Yeah, she was a really strict teacher.
Very strict.
Well, that's quite something that you didn't actually turn off of music altogether.
Well, you know, it's interesting. My parents were very happy that we played at a professional level, but they did not want us to go into music professionally. They wanted us to do, you know, the sort of the doctor-lawyer routine.
Yeah.
And they said that when we finished high school, we were not allowed to go to a conservatory. We had to go to college, and we couldn't major in music. So my brother went first. He went to Columbia. He was there for a year, and he dropped out. And he said he wasn't going back to school unless he could go to Curtis, where he went and studied with Rudolf Serkin.
Yeah.
I went to Swarthmore College, and I was the good boy. I did not major in music, but I continued to play professionally, and have played professionally, you know, for the next 50 years.
Oh, yeah, great. So Lea fled to the West. So she came to New England, or where did she come to?
She
first?
came to Philadelphia.
Philadelphia.
Yeah,
first.
to the Curtis Institute of Music.
Yeah.
But it was my uncle Boris who got established here in Boston, and both the Tanglewood connection. He taught for a while at Harvard. He was the head of the opera department for a while at the New England Conservatory, and he established an opera company here. Eventually, when they tore down the wonderful old opera house here, he decided to move the company to New York and had a studio at Carnegie Hall.
Most New Englanders don't know that there was a great opera house. It's now a dorm at Northeastern University, but there was a great opera house, and they used to perform 90 performances a year.
Yeah, it was a wonderful hall. One of the great tragedies of Boston history when that was torn down.
So, and you began, where did you begin your musical education? Did you?
In Philadelphia.
In Philadelphia?
Yeah, and then we went to Maine in the summer because the Curtis Institute of Music had a summer school in Rockport, Maine. When that was discontinued, my brother and I went to the founder of Curtis. We were teenagers, and we said, we would love to continue the concerts, and so she gave us money, and we established an organization.
I'm glad you talked about Maine, because your other book is called Musical Gifts, right here. Tell us a little about that.
Well, this wonderful colony of musicians, which was established in 1930 by Mrs. Bach, who, by the way, was the grandmother of Derek Bach of Harvard presidency fame, established this wonderful community. She bought houses on Rockport Harbor, and they gave concerts, and my grandmother had one of the teaching houses. And eventually, after the Second World War, they discontinued this, but many of the teachers continued to go there, and my brother and I went there, and we established something called Bay Chamber Concerts, which goes to this day, which was to continue the great tradition of Curtis concerts there. And this book tells about the history of that community it also tells some of the wonderful family stories. And if you would permit me, I would love to tell one.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the family on my mother's side were very musical.
Yes.
My father came from a traditional German Jewish family and had no musical talent. But when he married into the family, he decided he would take up an instrument, and he took up the flute. And he was terribly untalented, but he had great fun, and he would practice these little pieces that the great musicians of the time would arrange for piano and flute, piano and violin. And one of them had been arranged by Jascha Heifetz, the great violinist.
Yes.
Well, it so happened that one time Jascha Heifetz came to perform, and he came to the house to visit because he was a friend of the family. My father was very excited. He put the music out on the piano. He had his flute all set up, and Heifetz came in. He said, "Oh, somebody's playing my Andante and Presto." And my father said, "I am." And he said, "Would you like to play it with me?" And my father said, "Oh, yes." So he got his flute all ready, and they started the slow part, and my father struggled through it, and then the fast part started. And it started with the piano, and Heifetz started playing. He also played piano, and he played it quite fast. And my father said, "No, no, no, that's too fast." And Heifetz said, "But that's the way it goes." And my father said, "Not if you play it with me."
That's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Tom Wolf, for being with us. This is New England Authors. We're talking about the Nightingale Sonata. We record here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We broadcast on stations throughout New England. Remember, watch locally. Thank you.